Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Blake Holland, and alongside me are the men with all the answers, Mizzou softball and baseball, Chris Blake and Tanner Ludwig from the Columbia Missourian. And we're going to dive right into the softball diamond, where it was an interesting weekend for Mizzou softball. They lost 2 of 3, but they moved up 1 in the RPI rankings. Obviously, a tough test in T-Town, and a lot of controversy in yesterday's 3-1 loss against Alabama. Especially the Ashley Prange home run. So, Chris, we're going to go right to you. And that home run that ended up deciding the game 3-1. So how does Missouri bounce back from kind of like a heartbreaking loss like that going into SEC play?
Yeah, it has to light a fire under them, right? If you see on Twitter, a lot of the players, a lot of the coaches were retweeting things and saying, hey, that wasn't a home run, or, quote tweeting, putting a positive spin on it, saying, Cassidy Shomo in left field is incredible. Defensively, she's had a great year at the plate too, but they kind of took a positive spin on that, saying, look how good she is. She knocked this down. Maybe a way of slightly saying, hey, this is not a home run, which it really did not look like it was. So I think it has to light a fire under them and maybe almost even kind of bring them together even more if they weren't tight enough already. Like we mentioned last week, this is a really senior group. So if they weren't tight enough already, maybe this is just a little push to be like, hey, we were wronged a little bit. Like, let's do something special now. We can kind of make up for this.
Yeah, and this Tiger team was in it the entire series, playing neck and neck with number 6 Alabama, who's a great team in the country. So what did you take away from just this Tiger team and their ability to compete with top talent like that?
Yeah, I mean, this was the best series of the season, just from a pure competitiveness perspective, from an entertainment perspective. All 3 games were incredible, decided by 1-2 runs. No team scored more than 3. So that was my biggest takeaway, was the pitching. We knew Montana Fouts was going to be really good for Alabama, and she was dominant. But for Mizzou, I mean, Jordan Weber was outstanding. In game 1, she goes all 8 innings and gets the win there. So really the pitching from Missouri, the defense, to hold a team like that to 3 or fewer runs in all 3 games was really impressive. And, it's tough to do big things offensively against a pitcher like Fouts. So.
Yeah, but you kind of talked about that. They have a chance to face Alabama again in the SEC tournament coming up, depending on how it goes. So what are your realistic expectations for this Tiger team as they go into this SEC tourney with still a lot of momentum, even though they lost 2 of 3?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult for anyone. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind, is that if you look at the top 25 rankings, you look at the RPI, SEC is just littered. The top 10, the top 15 is littered with SEC teams, so it's going to be really hard for anyone. But I do think Mizzou has as good a chance as anybody does. I mean, we saw against Alabama, they could have won all 3 of those games. They didn't, but they could have, and that's kind of all you can ask for. So it's going to be a tough road. I think they should, and if there were odds, I think they would be the favorite against Auburn. And then you get really into the tough road of Alabama. If you win that game, you probably play Tennessee, and then if you win that game, you either get Arkansas or Kentucky, which are 1 and 4 in the conference respectively. So it's going to be a tough road for anyone, but they have as good a chance as anybody.
Yeah, and obviously Mizzou likely more than likely than not can't obviously host that regional. So what should they kind of shift their focus on and kind of gear up for this postseason, like you've been talking about?
Yeah, even, you would expect any team that's hosting the regional is going to be the favorite to come out of that kind of group. But I think Mizzou is probably one of the top teams that these regional hosts are thinking, we don't want them in our group of 4, So they can really, I don't want to say play spoiler, because that makes them sound like a big underdog, but they could come out of whatever region they're placed into. So it's kind of a thing of, no one wants them in their region, and they can go to a super regional.
Yeah, so Chris, last question I got for you today is just, what should Tiger fans expect from this team, especially with the postseason, with this hot start, senior-led group? How excited should Tiger fans be for this postseason?
I think it's a lot similar to what they should have expected at the beginning of the year than, maybe toward the middle of SEC play. Like I said, this is a team that you could expect to see in a super regional, even if they don't host that regional. So it's going to be a lot of competitive games. It's going to be a lot of interesting games, which for all the fans, it's going to be really fun to watch. But yeah, they can kind of do whatever, and I'm not going to be surprised if they're one of the final 16 teams come super regionals.
Awesome, Chris. Thank you. We're going to now move over to the baseball diamond, where the road continues to be a little bit struggling for Mizzou baseball on the road, especially at Ole Miss. They got swept again this weekend, and that really did not help their chances for qualifying for the SEC tournament. Now they're last in the SEC, trailing Kentucky and South Carolina. So, Tanner, we got to go right to you. And obviously, self-inflicted wounds were another major theme, especially on Sunday. And we kind of talked about that last week, about stringing or starting pitching and the bats coming alive and playing a complete game. And obviously, that was not the case this weekend. So how bad was this series sweep on the road at Ole Miss for Mizzou?
It was like about as bad as it could be, potentially. There's like 3 teams they're kind of battling for that final spot in the SEC tournament, Ole Miss being one of them. And then you mentioned it, Kentucky and South Carolina being the other 2. They now sit 2 games back of Kentucky and South Carolina, and there's only 6 games left to play in SEC, so they're going to kind of need to win out and hope that Kentucky and South Carolina lose a bunch of games if they want to get in. Like, it was the worst case scenario possibly for Mizzou this weekend.
Yeah, so what do you think went wrong in this series as a whole that Mizzou should scratch and then just kind of move on from?
You mentioned it there a little bit. They could not string hits together, self-inflicted wounds. I think on Sunday they gave up 3 free runs on pass balls and wild pitches. You can't do that against SEC teams. You're not going to win games just granting them 3 free runs. And then also Friday, the game they lost only by 2 runs. The Nando DeSadas, he had an error in the first inning. They got 2 unearned runs in the first inning. That's the difference in the game right there. You can't give teams, good teams like Ole Miss, who were previously ranked number 1, free runs. And then if you can't string those hits together and get that offense too, those are just going to put you in a huge hole. They only were out hit by Ole Miss like by 4 hits, but they lost by 8 on Sunday. They had double-digit hits, but only 2 runs. Like, when you're only getting like a single every inning, you're not going to score runs. You need to be able to get those hits at one time instead of just bracing them out, and they just haven't been able to do it on the road this season.
Yeah, and we talked about that last week, just playing the complete game, and they were not able to do that. I mean, obviously, playing behind puts a big strain, especially on the bats. So if you're playing from behind, and the starting pitching as well, which didn't go as deep as we anticipated they needed to win the series or win a game. So what do you consider, like, how much like optimism should like Tiger fans have with this team to even have a chance of making the SEC tournament now?
It's not going to be great. I'd say there's a decent chance they could probably take a couple games from Georgia, from Florida, especially Florida, because Florida's at home, and we see they're a much different team when they're at home. And Kentucky and South Carolina, their last 2 series aren't easy. Kentucky face Tennessee. South Carolina plays Tennessee. Kentucky faces some good teams too. So there's a chance that those teams could drop some games. But the problem is Mizzou has to win games on the road against a ranked Georgia team in their final series. And as we see this season, they just literally have not won a game on the road in SEC play. So they would have to kind of have a miracle to win 3 games against a top 20 team on Georgia. And so if they can manage to make that happen, their chances would go up greatly, but I just don't really see that happening.
Yeah, and that's a tough test because they're 0-12 now on the road in the SEC, which that's not good. That's not good. But some of the bright spots, though, from this weekend, as little as there were, it includes Justin Colon, also Carter Rustad's performance on Sunday. So how can they get back on track in these last 2 series and kind of gain some momentum and also kind of pray there's a couple slip-ups in the SEC for them to get that last spot?
The good news is, like I just mentioned it, they're at home this weekend against Florida, and they've won every game at home except for like 1 outside of the series opener. So they're a much different team at home with the fans behind them and the wind blowing in Taylor Stadium especially. That's when you see a lot of their bats coming alive in Taylor Stadium. So I think they have a good chance of taking at least 2 of these games against Florida, but they just need to pitch well. I mean, that's when everything starts with pitching. They got some runs in the first inning against Ole Miss, but every time they got runs in the first inning, Ole Miss got more or equal runs back in the very next half inning, and so that just kills your momentum. We talked about it a little bit, playing from behind. There's a much different team when you're able to put the pressure on people instead of having the pressure put on you, and so they just need to be able to get those pitchers through a couple clean innings, let those bats hit the ball, and that just keeps everything goes from there. It starts the momentum. It keeps your pitchers better, knowing when they're pitching with a lead, you can be a little bit more free with the ball. You don't have to worry about every single pitch as much. And so overall, I just think if they can just get decent pitching in the first 3 innings, that sets up their offense greatly and sets up the pitching greatly for the rest of the season, or gets the games in the series.
Yeah, so they're 25-20 right now. Obviously, last season they only won 15 games, so already a 10-win margin right there between this year and last season. So would you consider this season so far, depending on how these last two series go, successful in like the eyes of Tiger fans, or just in the right direction moving forward?
I think it depends kind of what your expectations were going into the season. If you wanted them to be a middle-of-the-pack SEC team, clearly they didn't do that. But the good news is, like you said, they only won 15 games last year, already 10 more games. And they were competitive in majority of their SEC series. Against Tennessee, they had the lead in a lot of those games. They were close games against the number one team in the nation. Against LSU, another ranked team. They've been in these close fights with these games. They almost took 2 out of 3 against Arkansas, a top 5 team. So the good news is they were competitive this year. They weren't as competitive last year. But again, they're still last in the SEC, so if you expected them to make the tournament, it's going to be a disappointing season. But just to have a competitive, good baseball team, that has to at least be some sort of success coming off of last year. And we saw a lot of bright spots, like you mentioned, Justin Colon, a freshman, Carlos Pena, a freshman. They have a couple of pieces you can see them building around for the future that showed out this season.
Gotcha. Tanner, thank you so much. Thank you guys for tuning in this week. Make sure to give Chris and Tanner a follow on Twitter for all things Mizzou, softball, and baseball. And until next time, I'm Blake Holland.